Hello, welcome back to Buckle Up. My name is Rob Wilson and this is the Nissan Leaf. Now it's been on sale for some 6 years now, so today I'm going to find out if Grandad can still cut it. Okay, so starting at the front, where it's actually quite typical Nissan in that it has that corporate face with these angular lights pointing towards a angular grille. In this case it's blanked in because obviously this car is electric, so it doesn't need all of the cooling that a petrol or diesel car would need. We've got the nice big Nissan badge there and a little camera here which comes as part of a 360-degree camera setup on this car. Now I'm going to have a little bit more detail on this part because this is where you charge it up. So if I open up this flap, which I can do by using the key, there's also a button in the car, you can see we've got two different forms of charging. The one on the left is Nissan's CHAdeMO charging infrastructure. That means you can charge it at 50 kilowatts, which isn't fantastic, but that is the fast charging setup on this car. The other one is your standard Type 2 charger, so you can use it like a wall box at home. It's about 6.6 kilowatts you can do the charging rate on this. So using the CHAdeMO, about 90 minutes to fully charge the car. Using the Type 2, it's going to be like 7 hours or something, but that's a lot better than if you charge it from a 3-pin plug, because then it's 21 hours. To be fair though, I have been using it this week and I've just been charging it from a 3-pin plug and it hasn't been a problem at all. Seems to charge relatively quickly overnight, so not been a problem for me. Anyway, to the side. At the side, I think maybe you get a bit more of an understanding of how big this car actually is. You can see it's quite tall for a family electric hatchback, but that's more down to the fact that the batteries are at the bottom of the car, and this was maybe one of the first to do that, so the technology's come on a little bit more. Cars have managed to get a bit lower, more aerodynamic, etc. Anyway, I want to talk about these wheels because I think they look really good. They look like Wolverine's claws, you know, like comes out, except on wheels. Anyway, this car is two-tone. You've got a black roof and then silver paintwork. Obviously that's all extra if you want that. You've got some chrome bits on the door handles, but yeah, that's sort of it. Anyway, let's go and have a look at the back. At the back then, not too much to talk about other than the lack of exhaust pipes, because of course we are in an electric vehicle. So what I'll do is I'll open up the boot and I'll have a sit down, a well-deserved sit down, because this car actually beats its closest rivals. It's got 426 litres of space with the seats up, and if you fold them down it's 1,167 litres, which is really quite good. What I will say though is it's not the most friendly usable space, because there is an absolutely enormous load lip. It's like halfway up my wrist and my hand is touching the bottom there. So if you're wanting to carry big items in and out, you are going to have to lift them over that lip, which is a little bit annoying. If you go for a car with the Bose sound system, which this one has, it is just sort of sat there, which is a little bit inconvenient, but that isn't necessarily the biggest problem, because even when you fold the rear seats down, there is a huge lip for them to go over as well, so you can't slide items forward, which does make it a little bit more impractical. But in terms of just sheer size, this boot is the biggest compared to its rivals, so plus point there. You also get a couple of bits on the side from some netting where you can find your charging cables, and they sit in there, which I actually think is a better solution than having them fit under the floor, because if you've got stuff in the boot regularly, you can't look under the floor. So having them there is better. Anyway, let's go and look at the back seats. Okay then, so the back seats of the Leaf. Let's start off with how much room I've got in here. As you can see, my knees, this seat is set up in my driver's position. For reference, I'm 6'2" or 188 centimeters tall, and I couldn't put my knees behind the seat if I was driving. I can, however, put them either side relatively comfortably, but that would then eat into the middle passenger's room. In terms of headroom, if I sit all the way up straight, obviously you can see my head is touching, but that's not the end of the world. I don't think there's many cars where my head wouldn't be touching of this size, so that's fine. I'm fine with that. What is a little bit of an issue is the fact that the floor is really quite high up. This is something that you do come across on EVs, but this one seems to be a bit more than others in class, like the MG4 or VW ID3. Because the floor is so high, even though the seats are raised up, the angle that my leg is at is not right. I just can't quite describe it. It doesn't feel as supportive, which is a shame because these seats are really comfortable, and on this top spec there are some nice leather material with some suede bits on them. In terms of materials back here, hard plastics on the top of the doors, but where you actually rest your arm, it's nice and squidgy with some leatherette as well. I have seat back pockets on both of the front seats. I've got a USB-A chargers, 2 of them down here, and a heated rear seat, but it's only one button and it's a little bit old-fashioned looking. It's just high and low. No armrest here. No matter how hard I try, I can't do anything with that. The other thing that is a little bit annoying is this quite large, it's not a transmission tunnel because there isn't one, but there's no, I don't really see why it needs to be this big. It definitely will eat into footroom. If you're in the middle seat, it won't necessarily be a big problem, but if you're like me, you're then going to have to move over and squidge up here if there's 3 people in the back. So really, I'd only recommend 2 adults in the back. I also do have a cup holder down here, which is big enough for a large bottle of water. That's nice. But other than that, yeah, let's just go into the front and see what's going on there. Okay, so now we are in the front of the Leaf, and I'm afraid this is where it starts to look a little bit old. That's probably the kindest thing I can say. This central setup is a little bit dated compared to rivals. I actually like the fact that you've got physical climate controls with proper buttons. That's a good thing. I think that the system in the ID3 is appalling, and I think that the system in the MG4 isn't brilliant either. This is much easier to use and you're less likely to have an accident while using it, but it does look a bit dated now. There is ways of making things still usable like this, but maybe a little bit easier on the eye. You have a 7-inch screen, which again is a lot smaller than rivals. It is touchscreen, and you can flick between going, on the audio or the sat nav, and you can wire up your Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, so it's still up to date in that respect, just maybe not quite as up to date as rivals, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Further down you have the on button, which I think is a stupid place for the on button to be. It should be here or literally anywhere else other than here. You've got a 12-volt socket there. You've got both heated seat buttons. Again, they look a bit old-fashioned with high and low. Then you've got a little cubby for your phone, which I actually think is quite good because it sits in about the right place, and because it's on an angle, it's not going to be rocking about and falling out and going down the footwell if you're braking or accelerating hard. Then we get to this bit, which is your drive selector. Now, there is a diagram that is on all models and it's printed there, and I feel like that's an omission on Nissan's part, because if this was an intuitive, well-designed gear selector, you wouldn't need a diagram telling me how to use it, because it's like that to go into drive, like that to go into reverse, press it down for park, just across for neutral, and if you want to go into braking mode, increase regen, then it's that again. I feel like there are better ways of doing drive selectors than this. It's a little bit old-fashioned and dated, and maybe it was cool when it first came out, but I quite frankly think it's a little bit annoying now. You do have some other cool buttons here though. They are auto park, which comes on this car because this is a top spec car and it's got some optional extras, and an e-pedal button, which is very exciting. I'll explain more about that when we drive. Practicality wise, well, I'm pleased to say that the water bottle that fits in the back fits in the door pocket there, and it fits in these two cup holders in the center. If I lift up the armrest, there's a little cubby here, but it's not the biggest in the world. There's enough room in there for, I don't know, some what's-its. You've got a glove box, which is pretty large actually, unusually big. Most cars nowadays only have glove boxes big enough for the manual, so good to see that. And then just generally the design here, the steering wheel is sporty because it has a flat bottom. You have an analog speedo, and then a digital screen on the left which can display many different things like your range, your battery, how eco you are, whether you're regenning or using power, or you can pretty much have anything you want in there, so that's good. I like that. Anyway, that's probably enough details about the front, so I think what we'll do now is just go and drive it, see how it handles. Okay, so driving the Nissan Leaf, and the first thing I want to talk about is how you sit in this car, because if you're familiar with the old first generation Leaf, then you'll know this, but if you have never been in a Leaf, you won't necessarily know. You sit really high up. I feel like I'm sat as high as I am in some SUVs. That's obviously because the batteries are under the floor, so everything's raised up a bit, but it does give you quite a big, nice, clear view ahead of you. That's quite a nice thing to have. It's more a crossover SUV seating position than it is a hatchback, so that's something to bear in mind. While we're talking about seats, I am not 100% certain that this has been designed for people who are over 6 foot, because the seat seems a little short, so I don't have full under-leg support that I would want. That also seems to be a problem on the Fiat 500. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but personally I'd want a little bit more support under my legs here. The seats themselves are very comfortable though, so no problems there. In terms of performance then, this is the 59 kilowatt hour battery version, so I have 217 PS on tap. I have 340 Newton meters of torque, which is a nice healthy amount. Top speed is quite low, 98 miles an hour, but that's sort of standard in this segment. 0 to 60 is pretty sprightly though, at just 6.9 seconds, which means it beats both the ID3 and MG4, which is pretty good. And I have to say that this handles better than both those cars, despite this being front wheel drive and those two being rear wheel drive. This is the most fun to drive, which I'm quite surprised at because it is the tallest, so you wouldn't necessarily think that, but when you chuck it into corners, it's actually quite playful and fun. The steering doesn't have that much in the way of feedback, but none of its rivals do either. Now you can get a smaller battery version of the Leaf, which is 39 kilowatt hours, but really I would recommend spending the extra and getting this bigger battery, because that smaller battery has a range of only 149 miles, And when we're talking about ranges that small, then we're talking about another class of car, which is like the Mini, the 500e, or a Funky Cat. And I think if I was going to spend my money on a car with a smaller range, those are the kind of cars I'd be looking at because they're more fun. Obviously, if you need the bigger car, this is your only option really. But yeah, 149 miles is lagging quite significantly behind rivals. It's also a second slower to 60. It only goes 89 miles an hour for its top speed. You get 20 Newton meters less torque, and you only get 150 PS as well. So yeah, not brilliant. Speaking of range, the 59 kilowatt hour battery in this car is good for 239 miles of range according to the WLTP testing cycle, although in the real world, as you'll see, my car was 99% charged and had a range of 242 miles, so actually better than the perfect lab conditions suggested, which is quite good to see. Now, that does bring me on to rivals. The ID3 and the MG4 can both go further, and that isn't necessarily the end of the world. We're talking about 20 or 30 miles further, especially when you're talking about the VW, because that is a more expensive car. It's several £1,000s more expensive than this. This starts at 35,000, but it can go up to silly amounts. This one is 38,500 with a couple of extras and the like. But the problem is, when this car came out, didn't really have any rivals. Now MG are here and they've got the 4, which starts at £27,500, which is, you know, it's a good chunk of money less. And even the smaller battery version is pretty comparable to this in terms of power and speed. And even if you go for the full top spec trophy model of the MG4, it's still nearly £5,000 cheaper than this. So that's quite a significant lump of cash in my opinion. I spend most of the time in this car driving around in eco, which sort of dulls off the throttle response, but if I take it out of eco, then we really can pick up quite quickly, which is quite fun. It's that electric instant torque that we're all becoming very used to. Let me talk you through the E-pedal, which I mentioned earlier. If I flick that on, essentially this means you can drive this car without ever needing to touch the brake pedal, which sounds a little bit crazy, but if I lift off, the regenerative braking has become so intense that I've slowed down from 55 miles an hour all the way to 0. And I didn't touch the brake pedal once. So in theory, when you're driving around town, you can drive this car just using one pedal. They won't tell you that. They won't advertise it as one pedal driving, because then there might be a lawsuit. Obviously, if you need to, brake, but it is certainly an interesting addition to this car. None of its rivals have regen that's that powerful, and it really does seem to help with the range when you have it on, especially when you're driving around town. So yeah, it's quite an interesting one to have. I will keep it off though, because I've played around with it, but I feel like if I had it on constantly, I would get too used to it, and then whenever I go back to my other car, once I give this car back to Nissan, I'll just forget to brake and just crash into the car in front of me, because you do get used to it fairly quickly. I'll just quickly mention the ride, because I actually think this car overall rides fairly well. It's not crashy over bumps around town. I think in town is where it's at its best. It can be a little unsettled though, let's say. It doesn't ever seem to just sort of be smooth, it's always fidgeting about, but it's not uncomfortable, it's just a bit sometimes. So I think it's definitely softer than both the MG4 and ID3, but yet, as I said, seems to handle better than both of them, which is very impressive. Obviously, Nissan have had their top engineers on this one. Maybe some people from Nismo, who knows? But it certainly feels really well set up. The one limiting factor of the handling is probably the tyres, because they are Dunlop Eco tyres, so they're not exactly full of grip. And that means that if you're out of eco mode and you do put your foot down, you can get a bit of tyre squeal quite easily, and it can become a little bit understeery. But if you're just driving normally, then this is the most fun out of its closest rivals. Anyway, that's probably enough driving about in the Leaf. Let's go back and do a conclusion. Okay then, so conclusion time, summing up the Nissan Leaf. Well, I'm actually surprised at how competent it still is, given how much more competition, in fact, it didn't really have any competition when it first went on sale. So the fact that it's still as good as it is, given the amount of time that has passed, is actually quite impressive. It's not without its flaws, but it's still actually a viable option for a family electric hatchback. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Make sure to give the video a like if you've enjoyed it. Comment down below if you've got something to say. Tell me what you think of the Nissan Leaf. Do you think it's still got it and can compete with modern rivals? Also, remember to subscribe to the channel. That is the most important thing that helps us out, and click the notification bell to be notified every time we make an upload. If you want to follow us in other fashions, all of the links to our social medias are down in the description. If you want to support the channel, you can do so in many different ways, by either becoming a member here on YouTube, giving thanks, joining our Patreon, or buying some of our merch, all linked below as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Bye!